I'm Valentina, 28 female. I live in a city that mistakes glass towers for a skyline and the hum of the stock market for a heartbeat. For a living, I analyze numbers for a company that has no idea who my father is, and I prefer it that way. My life is a quiet rebellion, lived in a modest apartment that my family's money could buy 1,000 times over. But this carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered by the very man I'd spent years trying to escape. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The summons didn't arrive on embossed letterhead or via a stern-faced courier. It came as a text message from my father, Julian, a man whose communication style was as brutally efficient as his business dealings. My office. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., don't be late. There was no greeting, no pleasantry, just a command. For the past 5 years since I had walked away from his firm, Montague Investments, our interactions had been sparse, limited to birthdays and holidays where the tension was thick enough to carve. This felt different. It felt like an ultimatum. The next morning, I stood before the monolithic Montague building, a monument to my father's ambition and my family's legacy. Walking through the polished marble lobby felt like stepping back in time. The air was still thick with the scent of old money and new anxiety. Employees, some of whom had known me since I was a child, offered polite, nervous smiles. They knew who I was, and they knew my history of defiance. To them, I was the prodigal daughter, the one who had inexplicably traded a corner office for a cubicle across town. My sister, Isabella, met me at the elevator. At 34, she was the perfect Montague heir, impeccably dressed, her smile a carefully calibrated weapon. She was the chief operating officer, my father's right hand, and the sibling who had always seen me as a rival, not a sister. "Valentina," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "running back to the kingdom so soon." "Just answering the king's summons, Bella," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You know how he gets when he's kept waiting." Her smile tightened. "He's in the main conference room. He's finalizing the quarterly distributions, a concept you might find foreign." The jab was typical Isabella. She believed I had thrown my birthright away for nothing, and she never missed a chance to remind me. I just nodded and walked past her, the sound of my sensible heels a stark contrast to the expensive click of her stilettos. The conference room was at the end of the hall, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city my father believed he owned. Julian was at the head of the massive oak table, flanked by 2 of his senior partners. He was 62, but his presence was as formidable as ever. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his suit tailored to perfection. He didn't look up when I entered, his attention fixed on the stack of documents before him. "You're late," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was 10:01 a.m. "The elevator was slow," I said, taking the empty seat across from him. The chair felt cold and unwelcoming. He finally looked up, his gray eyes pinning me in place. "We are here to discuss the future of this company, specifically your future with it." He gestured to a thin, leather-bound folder in the center of the table. "As you know, your grandfather's will stipulated that on your 28th birthday, certain clauses of the inheritance trust would be activated. That birthday was last month." I held my breath. My grandfather was a different breed of Montague. He had been kind, and he had seen the fire in me, the same fire that my father tried so hard to extinguish. He had always told me he would look out for me, even after he was gone. I had no idea what the clauses contained, as my father had kept the trust documents locked away. "Your grandfather, in his infinite and often sentimental wisdom," Julian continued, his tone dripping with disdain, "believed that blood should always have a place at the table. The clause states that you are to be offered a senior executive position with a commensurate share package. A position, I might add, that others work their entire lives for." He slid the folder across the table. "This is the offer. Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions, a 7-figure salary, a seat on the board, all you have to do is sign." It was a golden ticket, a return to the gilded cage I had fought so hard to escape. My mind raced. Why now? Why so generous? My father never gave anything away for free. There was always a price, always a catch. Isabella glided into the room and stood behind him, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. This was her victory lap. She was sure I would refuse, cementing my status as the family outcast and clearing her path to the CEO throne. I.O. Pen the folder. The contract was dense with legal jargon, but the numbers were clear. It was an offer designed to be irresistible. But as I scanned the pages, a single paragraph caught my eye. It was buried deep within the section on board responsibilities, a subclause that seemed innocuous at first glance. It stated that by accepting the position, I would be waiving any and all rights to contest future leadership appointments or company restructuring decisions made by the current CEO. There it was, the poison pill. He wasn't offering me a seat at the table, he was offering me a muzzle. He wanted to bring me back into the fold, but only on his terms. He would parade me as the returned daughter, a symbol of family unity, while legally stripping me of any power to challenge him or Isabella. He was buying my silence, my compliance. He was trying to neutralize the one person who had ever dared to say no to him. I looked up from the folder, my gaze meeting his. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the distant city traffic. The two partners stared at me, their faces unreadable masks of corporate neutrality. Isabella's smirk widened. They all expected me to storm out, to throw the offer back in his face, to prove once and for all that I was too emotional, too unpredictable for their world. My heart was pounding, a mix of anger and a sudden, cold clarity. He had underestimated me. He had always underestimated me. He saw the girl who had walked away 5 years ago, not the woman she had become. He had no idea that I had spent those 5 years honing my skills as a financial analyst, learning to see the stories that numbers tell, the secrets hidden in plain sight on a balance sheet. I closed the folder gently, my hand steady. "This is a very generous offer, Father," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'll need some time to review it with my lawyer." The surprise on his face was fleeting but satisfying. He had expected a fight, not a negotiation. Isabella's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "There's nothing to review," Julian said, recovering quickly. "It's a standard executive contract. Take it or leave it, Valentina." "Every contract is negotiable," I replied, standing up. I pushed the chair back in, a small act of defiance. "I'll have my response by the end of the week." I turned and walked out of the room, feeling their eyes on my back. I didn't look back. As the elevator doors closed, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. My father had just declared war, assuming I was unarmed. But he was wrong. He had no idea that I had spent years preparing for this battle. He had pushed his papers across the table, confident in his victory. But I had a folder of my own, and it was going to make him go silent. The game had just begun. The week that followed was a blur of calculated moves and quiet preparation. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to Marcus, the man who managed my family's estate. Marcus had been a protege of my grandfather, and he was one of the few people in my father's orbit that I trusted implicitly. He held a deep loyalty not to Julian, but to the legacy my grandfather had built, a legacy of integrity he felt Julian was tarnishing. We met at a small, unassuming coffee shop miles away from the financial district. Marcus, a man of 45 with kind eyes and a sharp legal mind, listened intently as I recounted the meeting. He wasn't surprised. "It's a power play, Valentina," he said, stirring his coffee. "A classic Julian Montague move. He wants to consolidate his control and ensure Isabella is his undisputed successor. That clause is designed to legally gag you." "He thinks I'll either refuse out of pride or sign out of greed," I said. "He can't imagine a third option." "Which is?" "That I fight back," I stated plainly. "Grandfather put that clause in his will for a reason. He wanted me to have a place at the firm, a real one. He wanted me to be a check on my father's ambition. Julian is trying to corrupt the spirit of the will while adhering to its letter." Marcus nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. Your grandfather was a wise man. He saw the trajectory Julian was on. He feared that without a balancing force, Julian would sacrifice the company's long-term health for short-term gains and personal ego. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. He was right to be worried. For the past few years, there have been whispers, rumors of risky ventures, of projects that don't quite add up on the balance sheets. This confirmed a suspicion I had harbored for a long time. From the outside, Montague Investments was a fortress of stability. But I knew my father. His appetite for risk was enormous, often masked by an outward projection of conservative strategy. "I need access, Marcus," I said, my voice firm. "I need to see the full trust documentation, my grandfather's original notes, anything that can give me leverage. And I need to look at the company's books, not the polish." Ed quarterly reports they release to the public, but the raw, internal ledgers. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Access to the trust documents is your right. I can get you those by this afternoon. But the internal ledgers, that's a different beast. Julian keeps those under lock and key. Only he, Isabella, and the CFO have unrestricted access. Getting them would be difficult." "Difficult but not impossible," I pressed. He gave me a long, searching look. "Your grandfather once told me, the biggest risks are the ones you don't take. He would want me to help you. There's a junior accountant in the firm, a young man named David. His father worked with your grandfather for 30 years. The family is loyal to the old Montague way of doing things. I might be able to persuade him to help, but it would be putting his career on the line." "I would never ask him to do anything illegal," I assured him. "I just need a window, a look at the accounts that seem unusual, the ones that don't fit the company's stated investment strategy." "I'll see what I can do," Marcus promised. "But you need to be careful, Valentina. If Julian gets a whiff of what you're planning, he'll shut you down before you even begin." That afternoon, a secured digital file arrived in my inbox. It contained the complete trust and estate documents of my grandfather. I spent the next 2 days poring over every word, every clause, every footnote. And there, tucked away in an appendix, I found it. It was a handwritten addendum from my grandfather, penned just months before he passed away. It was a personal letter, addressed to me. He wrote of his pride in my independence and my spirit. He also wrote of his fears about my father. "Your father is a brilliant man," he had written, "but his ambition can be a blinding force. He sees the company as his own creation, forgetting that it was built on a foundation of trust and prudence. I have left you a key, my dear Valentina, should you ever need to unlock the truth." The key was a reference to a small, privately held company called North Star Holdings. My grandfather had established it years ago as a personal investment vehicle. According to his notes, he had used it to acquire a single, crucial asset, a small, independent accounting firm. The firm's name was Harrison and Associates, and it held the original auditing contract for Montague Investments, dating back to the company's inception. While my father had long since moved the company's primary auditing to a larger, more pliable firm, he had never formally terminated the original contract with Harrison and Associates. It was a loose end, an oversight. My grandfather had purchased the entire firm simply to keep that contract alive, and he had willed North Star Holdings, and by extension, Harrison and Associates, directly to me. I sat back in my chair, the pieces clicking into place. As the owner of the auditing firm that still held a technically active contract, I had the legal right to request and review the financial records of Montague Investments. It was an old, dusty right, one my father had likely forgotten about decades ago, but it was ironclad. My grandfather hadn't just left me a key, he had left me a battering ram. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an encrypted app, the one Marcus had told me to install. The message was from a user named Orion David. It contained a single line of text: "Project Nightingale. Check the funding allocations from the last 2 quarters." Project Nightingale? I had never heard of it. It had never been mentioned in any public reports or shareholder briefings. Armed with my grandfather's key and a cryptic clue, I felt a surge of determination. My father and Isabella thought they were playing chess, moving their pieces to corner me. They had no idea I was about to flip the entire board. The legacy my grandfather had built was being betrayed, used as a personal piggy bank for my father's reckless ambitions. I wasn't just fighting for my own future anymore. I was fighting for the soul of the company, for the integrity of the Montague name. And I was finally ready to see just how deep the rot went. Gaining access to the Montague investments headquarters was easy. I was still family, after all. The challenge was navigating the familiar corridors without raising suspicion. I timed my visit for a Friday evening, the one day a week my father left the office promptly at 6 for his standing dinner reservation at an exclusive downtown club. Isabella, ever the socialite, was likely attending a charity gala. The office would be quiet, staffed only by a skeleton crew of night security and the most work-obsessed junior analysts. I had arranged to meet David, our anonymous source Orion, in a small, rarely used records room on the 34th floor. It was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with filing cabinets containing paper records from a pre-digital era. It was the perfect place for a discreet conversation. David was younger than I expected, barely in his mid-20s, with a nervous energy that made him constantly adjust his glasses. But behind the anxiety, his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He clutched a tablet to his chest like a shield. "Miss Montague," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I shouldn't be doing this, if your father finds out." "He won't," I said, trying to project a calm I didn't entirely feel. "David, your father was one of my grandfather's most trusted employees. Marcus told me you believe in the same principles they did. I'm only trying to protect that legacy." His posture relaxed slightly. "My dad always said your grandfather was the soul of this place. He wouldn't like what it's become." He took a deep breath. "Project Nightingale. It's officially classified as a new market real estate venture in South America. The capital allocations for it are staggering. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars over the past year." "Real estate is my father's usual playground," I mused. "He prefers tech and biotech. Less overhead, cleaner exit strategies." "Exactly," David said, his fingers flying across the tablet screen. He pulled up a series of internal requisitions and wire transfer confirmations. "That's what caught my eye. The funds aren't going to established developers or holding companies. They're being funneled through a series of newly created shell corporations, all based in the Cayman Islands. The paper trail is deliberately convoluted." My blood ran cold. Shell corporations and offshore accounts were the classic hallmarks of fraud. My father was either hiding a massive, unsanctioned investment, or he was siphoning money out of the company. "But the project has to have some kind of internal documentation, right?" I asked. "Projections, risk assessments, board approvals." David shook his head. "That's the other thing. All documentation related to Nightingale is sealed under the direct authority of the CEO. It bypasses the normal risk assessment committees. The only people who have seen the full file are your father and your sister." He swiped to another screen. "And one other person. The project's external consultant, a man named Alejandro Vargas." The name didn't ring a bell. "Who is he?" "I don't know," David admitted. "His invoices are vague, they just list consulting services. But they're regular and they're large, he's being paid a fortune. But here's the strangest part." He pointed to a detail on the invoice. It was a routing number. "That's not a corporate account, that's a personal bank routing number." This was more than just a risky investment. This was deeply corrupt. Paying a consultant for a multi-hundred-million-dollar project directly into their personal account was unthinkable in any legitimate enterprise. It was a brazen act, a sign that my father believed he was completely untouchable. "Is there any way to see what this project actually is?" I asked. "Any physical files, blueprints, prospectuses?" David's face paled. "The Nightingale file is kept in the CEO's office, in his personal safe." Of course it was. My father's office was a fortress. Getting in there would be impossible. But as I processed the information, a memory surfaced. A conversation from years ago during a family dinner. My father had been boasting about his new office renovations, specifically about a state-of-the-art security system. "It's a biometric safe," I said, thinking aloud. "Fingerprint and retinal scan." David's shoulders slumped. "Then it's impossible." "Maybe not," I countered, an idea beginning to form. "He's the only one with access." "Him and Isabella," David confirmed. "She was added to the biometric security profile last year when she was promoted to COO. Isabella, my sister, who valued her social life above all else. My sister, who was almost certainly at the annual museum benefit gala tonight, an event she chaired and would never dream of leaving early. My sister, who had a habit of being careless when she was celebrating. David, I need you to do one more thing for me," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Can you get me the security logs for the executive floor? Specifically, the access logs for my father's office for the past 48 hours. He looked hesitant, the fear returning to his eyes. That's a much higher security clearance. I could be fired, I could face legal action." "I know what I'm asking," I said, meeting his gaze. "But if my father is running a secret, off-the-books operation of this magnitude, the entire company is at risk. Your job, everyone's job, could disappear overnight if this thing blows up. Help me get the truth, and I promise I will protect you." He wrestled with the decision for a long moment, the silence in the dusty room stretching on. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "Give me 10 minutes." He slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with the ghosts of old paper and the burgeoning weight of my discovery. The whispers I had heard from Marcus were turning into a roar. This wasn't just my father being reckless. This was a calculated, deliberate betrayal of the company, of the employees, and of my grandfather's legacy. He and Isabella were in it together, building a secret empire with company funds, and they were using a phantom real estate project as their cover. My phone vibrated, a new message from Orion. It was a screenshot of a security log. Isabella had accessed their father's office at 8:05 p.m., just before leaving for her gala. That was expected, but there was another entry, a guest entry. An override code had been used to grant temporary access to the executive suite at 8:15 p.m. The name logged for the guest was Alejandro Vargas. Vargas was here, tonight. He had been in my father's office just hours ago. A cold, hard knot of anger formed in my stomach. The confrontation I had been planning for the end of the week had just been moved up. My father had lied, and my sister was his accomplice. The fight for the company had become intensely personal. I wasn't just an heir anymore. I was an investigator, and I was closing in on the truth. The walls of the Montague building had secrets, and they were finally starting to speak to me. The knowledge that Alejandro Vargas had been in the building just hours ago changed everything. The plan to use my grandfather's legal key felt too slow, too methodical. A storm was brewing inside Montague Investments, and I needed to get ahead of it. My father and Isabella weren't just poor stewards of the company, they were actively looting it, and Vargas was their accomplice. My next move had to be precise. I couldn't risk a direct confrontation without irrefutable proof. I needed more than just suspicious wire transfers and a name on a visitor log. I needed to follow the paper trail right to its source. I spent the weekend in a self-imposed lockdown, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of purpose. With the information from David, I started digging into Alejandro Vargas. Publicly, he was almost a ghost. There were no social media profiles, no business listings, no press releases. But ghosts always leave a trace. I shifted my search to international financial registries and corporate ownership databases, the kind of deep dive research I specialized in at my own firm. After hours of cross-referencing Shell Corporation names from David's data with incorporation documents filed in the Cayman Islands and Panama, I found him. Vargas was listed as the sole director of a dozen different entities, all of which were receiving funds from Montague Investments under the Project Nightingale designation. He was a professional money launderer, a specialist in creating complex corporate structures designed to make money disappear. But the most damning discovery came from an obscure Panamanian shipping manifest. One of Vargas's shell companies had recently purchased a fleet of high-end drilling and excavation equipment. The equipment wasn't shipped to South America, the supposed location of the real estate venture. It was shipped to a remote, privately owned mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A quick search of the mine's ownership led me to the final, sickening piece of the puzzle. The mine wasn't owned by some anonymous conglomerate. It was owned by a holding company, and the holding company was owned by another, and so on, through a dizzying chain of shell corporations that ended with a single name: Isabella Montague. The breath caught in my throat. Project Nightingale wasn't a real estate project. It was a front for a conflict minerals operation. My father was using company funds to secretly finance an illegal mining operation run by my sister. They were plundering the family business to build their own private, unethical empire. The sheer scale of the deception was staggering. It was reckless, illegal, and morally bankrupt. My grandfather, who had served on the boards of 3 different human rights organizations, would have been utterly destroyed. Armed with this devastating truth, I knew I had to accelerate my timeline. I contacted Marcus. We met early Monday morning, before the city had fully woken up. I laid out everything I had found: the shell corporations, the invoices to Vargas, the shipping manifests, the mine's ownership. Marcus stared at the documents spread across his desk, his face grim. I knew Julian was running things into the ground, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. This isn't just a breach of fiduciary duty, it's criminal. This could bring down the entire company. We're talking about international sanctions, criminal charges. "This is the leverage I need," I said, my voice steely. "The contract he offered me, the one that muzzles me, is now irrelevant. This changes the entire game." "What's your plan?" he asked. "My father's offer is on the table until Friday," I said. "I'm going to use that. Time to prepare my own. I'm going to exercise my rights as the owner of Harrison and Associates. I am formally requesting a full, independent audit of Montague Investments, effective immediately, with a specific focus on all accounts and projects related to Project Nightingale and its affiliated entities." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's a declaration of war, Valentina. The moment you file that request, he will know you're onto him. He will retaliate." "Let him," I replied. "He's expecting me to come back to him as a disgruntled daughter. Instead, I'm going to approach him as a legally empowered auditor with a mountain of evidence. But I'm not going to file the request through normal channels. I'm going to deliver it myself, at the next board meeting." "The quarterly board meeting is this Friday," Marcus said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "He'll never see it coming." "Exactly. He'll be sitting there, waiting for my signed contract, ready to announce my return to the fold on his terms. Instead, I'll be serving him with a formal audit demand in front of the entire board of directors." The next few days were spent in a whirlwind of legal preparation. Marcus and his team worked around the clock, drafting the audit request, compiling the evidence into a clear and undeniable presentation, and preparing for the inevitable legal battle that would follow. We assembled everything into a single, thick folder. It was my weapon, my shield, and the instrument of my family's reckoning. We also took steps to protect our source. Marcus arranged for a high-powered law firm to represent David, ensuring he would have full immunity in exchange for his testimony if it came to that. We moved him to a secure location, his resignation from Montague Investments already tendered. He had taken a great risk, and I was determined to see him protected. By Thursday night, everything was in place. I held the folder in my hands. It felt heavy, not just with the weight of the paper inside, but with the weight of the future. The path I was about to take would fracture my family permanently. There would be no going back. But as I thought of my grandfather's letter, of his faith in me, I knew I had no other choice. My father had built his power by ensuring no one ever had access to the full paper trail. He controlled the narrative by controlling the information. But he had made a critical mistake. He had forgotten about a dusty, old auditing contract, and he had underestimated the daughter he had pushed away. He didn't know that I had spent my entire professional life learning how to read between the lines, how to follow the faintest scent of ink on a page until it led to the truth. The paper trail had ended, and now my own trail was about to begin. It would lead me straight back to that conference room, to the head of that oak table, where this whole ordeal had started. The morning of the board meeting was gray and overcast, the sky hanging low over the city like a shroud. It mirrored my mood perfectly, a somber mix of resolve and anxiety. I dressed with meticulous care in a dark gray suit, the kind of corporate armor I had long since abandoned. Today, I was not just Valentina, the estranged daughter. I was Valentina Montague, a shareholder, and more importantly, the owner of Harrison and Associates, and I needed to look the part. The folder sat on my passenger seat as I drove towards the Montague building. It was my only companion, a silent testament to the week's frantic work. Inside it lay the evidence of my father's and sister's betrayal, neatly organized and cross-referenced. Copies of the wire transfers, the shell company registrations, the shipping manifests, the deed to the Congolese mine in Isabella's name, and at the very front, the formal, legally binding demand for a full forensic audit. My counteroffer was not for a position or a salary. It was an ultimatum. I had timed my arrival for exactly 10 minutes after the board meeting was scheduled to begin. I wanted them to have settled in, to have dispensed with the initial pleasantries. I wanted my entrance to be an interruption, a disruption to their carefully managed world. The receptionist in the lobby, a woman who had known me since I was a child, looked up in surprise. "Valentina, what a surprise. Is your father expecting you?" "In a way," I said with a small, tight smile, and walked towards the executive elevator without breaking my stride. I no longer needed permission. The 40th floor was quiet. The boardroom doors were closed. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of my father's voice from within. I took a deep breath, clutching the folder to my chest, and pushed the doors open. The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. The board of directors, a collection of old money scions and corporate yes-men my father had curated over the years, stared in stunned surprise. My sister, Isabella, who was seated at my father's right hand, looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her face, usually a mask of smug composure, was momentarily slack with shock. And then there was my father. He was mid-sentence, and his mouth hung open for a split second before he snapped it shut. His eyes, cold and gray, narrowed into slits. The surprise quickly morphed into a dark, simmering rage. "Valentina," he said, his voice dangerously low, "this is a private meeting. You are not welcome here." "On the contrary, father," I said, my voice ringing out with a clarity and strength that surprised even me. "I believe I am. I'm here as a concerned shareholder, and I'm here on behalf of Harrison and Associates, the company's original and still contracted auditing firm." I walked calmly to the empty space at the far end of the long oak table, placing my folder down with a soft but decisive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the silent room. "I believe you're all waiting on my response to a very generous job offer," I continued, my eyes sweeping across the faces of the board members before landing back on my father. "Well, I have it here. You could call it a counteroffer." Isabella scoffed, recovering her composure. "Don't be ridiculous, Valentina. You have no standing here. This is a pathetic attempt to get attention." "Am I, Bella?" I asked, my voice laced with ice. "Are you sure you want to dismiss me so quickly? Perhaps we should talk about Project Nightingale." The name landed like a grenade in the center of the room. I saw a flicker of panic in Isabella's eyes. My father's face became an unreadable mask of stone, but I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. The other board members looked at each other in confusion. "Project Nightingale is a classified real estate venture," my father said, his voice tight. "It is not a topic for public discussion." "That's where you're wrong," I said, opening my folder. Because I don't think it's a real estate venture at all. I think it's a front. A front for a massive, off-the-books operation to siphon millions of dollars of company funds into a private mining operation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A mine that is, coincidentally, owned by my sister. I began to slide copies of the documents across the polished table. The wire transfers, the shell company deeds, the shipping manifests for mining equipment. Each page landed in front of a different board member. The room was filled with the soft rustle of paper, a sound that was suddenly more powerful than any shouting match could ever be. Men who had spent their lives looking at financial reports began to scan the pages, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern and then to outright alarm. They were my father's allies, but they were also businessmen. They understood what they were looking at. They were looking at massive, undeniable fraud. "This is absurd," Isabella stammered, her voice losing its edge. "These documents could be fakes." "Are they?" I countered, turning to her directly. "Is your signature on this deed a forgery? Is this photo of you, meeting with Alejandro Vargas at a cafe in Geneva 2 months ago, a deepfake?" I slid the final photograph into the center of the table. It showed Isabella, smiling and shaking hands with the ghost who had been in their office just last week. Isabella stared at the photo, her face ashen. She was speechless. Finally, I turned my full attention back to my father. He hadn't looked at a single document. His gaze was fixed on me, burning with a cold, murderous fury. He had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. "So, here is my counteroffer," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "There will be no new position for me. Instead, effective immediately, both of you will resign from your positions at Montague Investments. You will cede your voting shares to a blind trust to be managed by an independent trustee. You will walk away from this company and never come back." A wave of murmurs and gasps went around the table. "And if we refuse?" my father growled. "If you refuse," I said, tapping the thick folder in front of me, "then a complete copy of this file, along with my sworn testimony, will be delivered to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and the international press by noon today. I will personally see to it that your legacy is not one of corporate success, but of corporate crime. You will lose everything. The company, your freedom, the family name you claim to cherish so much. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was absolute. The power in the room had shifted completely. It no longer radiated from the head of the table where my father sat. It radiated from my end, from a simple paper folder filled with the truth. My father had wanted me to sign his papers, to accept his terms. Instead, I had crafted my own, and they were non-negotiable. The boardroom felt like a vacuum, all the air sucked out by my ultimatum. The board members, men who were accustomed to predictable quarterly reports and deferential presentations, looked back and forth between me and my father, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They were rats on a sinking ship, and they were desperately trying to figure out which way to jump. My father, Julian, was a predator backed into a corner. The cold fury in his eyes began to burn hot. For a moment, I thought he might lunge across the table, that all his carefully constructed corporate polish would shatter, revealing the tyrant beneath. "You would dare," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You would dare to destroy this family, to destroy your own name." "You destroyed it," I replied, my voice unwavering. "You did this, you and Isabella. You used this company as your personal bank, and you betrayed every employee, every shareholder, and everything grandfather ever stood for. The Montague name you're so worried about, you tarnished it. I'm the one trying to save it." One of the oldest board members, a man named Mr. Abernathy who had served with my grandfather, cleared his throat. He picked up one of the documents, the deed to the mine with Isabella's name on it. "Julian," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "is this true?" My father didn't answer. He just glared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles bulge. That was all the confirmation Abernathy and the rest of the board needed. Isabella, who had been frozen in her seat, finally broke. "He made me do it," she cried, her voice cracking. She pointed a shaking finger at our father. It was his idea, the whole thing. Project Nightingale, Vargas, all of it. He said it was a way to secure our family's future, to build something that was truly ours. The pathetic attempt to save herself was the final nail in their coffin. Her confession, blurted out in a moment of pure panic, erased any lingering doubt in the room. My father looked at his eldest daughter, his chosen heir, with utter contempt. In his world, loyalty was everything, and she had just committed the ultimate sin. He had been betrayed by the one person he thought was his perfect accomplice. "Get out," he snarled at her. "Get out of my sight." Isabella burst into tears, a messy, ugly display that stripped away her years of cultivated poise. She stumbled out of the boardroom, her sobs echoing in the hallway. Now, it was just me and my father. The board members were merely spectators to the final act of a family tragedy they had unwittingly enabled for years. "You have 1 hour," I said, my voice cold as ice. "The resignation letters for you and Isabella, signed and on this table, along with the signed transfer of your voting shares to the trust. If they are not here in 1 hour, I make the calls." I turned to the board. "I would advise all of you to remain here and consult with your legal counsel. The company is now in a state of crisis, and your actions in the next hour will be heavily scrutinized." I picked up my folder, turned my back on my father, and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't go far. I went to the small, empty office next door, leaving the door slightly ajar. I sat in a chair that faced the door and waited. It was the longest hour of my life. I could hear the frantic, muffled sounds from the boardroom, raised voices, the scraping of chairs, the arrival of the company's general counsel. My father was fighting, trying to find a way out, but there was none. I had built the cage of evidence too perfectly. Any move he made would only tighten the trap. 45 minutes later, Marcus arrived. I had called him the moment I left the boardroom. He entered the small office and gave me a nod. "They're drafting the documents," he said quietly. "He has no choice. You won." The word "won" felt hollow. There was no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. This wasn't a corporate takeover, it was the surgical amputation of my own family. At the 58-minute mark, a visibly shaken Mr. Abernathy appeared at the doorway. "Valentina," he said, his voice strained, "it's done." I stood up and walked back into the boardroom with Marcus at my side. The atmosphere was funereal. My father was standing by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the city that had been his kingdom. 2 resignation letters and a stack of share transfer documents sat in the center of the table. I walked to the table and picked them up. I scanned them quickly, my analyst's eye checking every detail. They were all there, all signed. Julian Montague and Isabella Montague had officially been excised from Montague Investments. I handed the documents to Marcus, who placed them securely in his briefcase. "A transitional leadership committee will be formed from the remaining board members," I announced to the room. "An interim CEO will be appointed by the end of the day, and Harrison and Associates will begin its full forensic audit tomorrow morning. We are going to uncover every discrepancy, and we are going to fix it. We will be transparent. And we will rebuild the trust that has been broken." I finally turned to look at my father. He hadn't moved. He stood, defeated, a king without a crown. I expected to feel a sense of victory, of vindication. Instead, all I felt was a vast, empty ache. I walked towards him. He didn't turn around, but I knew he could feel my presence. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The company was successful, we had everything. Why risk it all for this?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the city below. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. "It was never enough. Your grandfather, he built this company, but he never truly respected me. He always saw me as a manager, not a visionary. I wanted to build an empire that dwarfed his, something that was mine alone." He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a tyrant or a CEO. I just saw a sad, broken old man, consumed by his own ego and insecurity. "He loved you more," he said simply. He saw himself in you, the one who would question everything, the one he could trust. He left you that key, didn't he? He was always betting against me. That was the heart of it. It had never been about money. It had been about a lifelong rivalry with a ghost, a battle he could never win. "Goodbye, Father," I said and walked away. The unveiling was complete. The secrets were out, the lies exposed. But as I left the Montague building for what I knew was the last time as a visitor, I realized the real work was just beginning. The weeks following the boardroom confrontation were a controlled, chaotic whirlwind. The resignations of Julian and Isabella sent shockwaves through the financial community. The official story, carefully crafted by a crisis management team Marcus and I hired, was one of an orderly leadership transition due to personal health and family reasons. It was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one to prevent a catastrophic collapse of investor confidence. The truth would come out eventually, but it would be on our terms, after we had stabilized the company. I didn't take the CEO position myself. I knew that would be seen as a power grab, a daughter simply supplanting her father. Instead, I took a seat on the board, and as the representative of the firm conducting the audit, I oversaw the cleanup. We appointed Mr. Abernathy as the interim CEO. His deep roots in the company and his untarnished reputation were exactly what we needed to signal a return to stability and integrity. The forensic audit conducted by Harrison and Associates was brutal. It uncovered the full extent of the Project Nightingale fraud. My father and sister had funneled nearly $250 million out of the company over 3 years. The damage was severe, but thanks to the company's strong underlying assets, it was not fatal. We had to make difficult decisions. We quietly liquidated the illegal mining operation, taking a massive loss, but severing all ties to the unethical venture. We self-reported the financial irregularities to the SEC, positioning ourselves as the new leadership team cleaning up the misdeeds of the old. By getting ahead of the story, we were able to control the narrative and negotiate a settlement that, while costly, saved the company from criminal prosecution. My father and Isabella were not so lucky. As part of our settlement, the SEC launched its own investigation into them personally. Faced with overwhelming evidence, they were indicted on multiple counts of fraud and money laundering. Their assets were frozen, their reputations shattered. The empire they had tried to build in the shadows had crumbled into dust. I did not attend their court hearings. My involvement had ended the day I walked out of that boardroom. They were no longer a part of my life. My days were spent in long meetings, working with Abernathy and the new executive team to chart a new course for Montague Investments. We rebuilt the company from the ground up, not on the shifting sands of my father's ego, but on the solid bedrock of transparency and ethical practice my grandfather had originally established. We implemented new oversight committees, strengthened internal controls, and changed the very culture of the place from one of fear and blind loyalty to one of collaboration and accountability. It was exhausting, grueling work. There were days when I felt the weight of it all might crush me, but then I would think of my grandfather's letter, of his faith in me, and I would find the strength to continue. About 6 months into the rebuilding process, I was working late in my new office, the one that had once belonged to my father. I was looking over a proposal for a new clean energy investment fund, a project that would have been unthinkable under my father's reign, when Marcus knocked on the door. "Working late?" he asked with a warm smile. "The work never stops," I replied, gesture. "Ing for him to come in." He placed a thin folder on my desk. It was different from the one I had carried into the boardroom that fateful day. This one was light. "What's this?" I asked. "The final report from the auditors," he said. "The company is officially clean. We've accounted for all the missing funds, restructured the debt, and the SEC has formally closed its corporate investigation. We're in the clear." He paused. "You did it, Valentina. You saved it." I opened the folder. The neat columns of numbers and carefully worded summaries told a story of recovery, of a company pulled back from the brink. I closed it and looked around the office. The panoramic view of the city was the same, but it felt different now. It was no longer a symbol of my father's conquest, but a reminder of the responsibility that now rested on my shoulders. My grandfather would be proud, I said softly. He always was, Marcus replied. We stood in silence for a moment, the city lights twinkling below. The past year had been a trial by fire. I had lost a father and a sister, but in doing so, I had found a purpose I never knew I was looking for. I had not set out to run a company or to build a legacy. I had only wanted to uncover the truth, but in the end, they had become the same thing. My father had pushed his papers across the table, expecting me to fold. He never imagined that my own folder would not only make him go silent, but would also become the blueprint for a new beginning. The old foundation, rotten with greed and secrets, had been torn down, and in its place, we were building something new, something stronger, something worthy of the Montague name.